first story is called The Doctor's House. Deep in the countryside and bordered by forested hills, the small village of Rushideen is set amongst a patchwork of ancient fields where farmers raise dairy cows, sheep, pigs, and poultry. And next to pastures where animals graze, wheat, barley, corn, cabbage, potato, carrot, parsnip, and all manner of other crops grow in the richness of dark brown earth. It has always been this way. One might even think the fast modern outside world had never touched this place. Many of the cottages are hundreds of years old. Some even have thatched roofs, but none have a garage, and very few possess a car. How do they do their shopping, you might ask? Well, there is one shop which, although it is very small, seems to have everything in it. It even has a little post office. This is very important, because there are lots of old people living in Rushideen, and it is at the post office that they collect the money for their old age pensions. Of course, some folk think places like this can be very dull and unexciting, but that would not explain why so many people from busy towns come to visit it at weekends. Maybe they do that because the place is so pretty. At the heart of Rushideen is a large village green with a duck pond and 2 benches placed under the cooling shade of an old oak tree, where people with children come to sit and feed all sorts of birds with bread and bits of their sandwiches. In summer months, village men put on their white shirts and white trousers to play cricket on the green. Sometimes batsmen hit cricket balls into the pond, causing a sudden splash that makes ducks and geese fly off in panic. That's when some of the cricketers have to take off their shoes, roll up their trousers, and wade into the wheeze and sludgy ooze of the pond to search for the lost ball. It's all part of the fun, and made even jollier, because there is always a steady stream of people between the cricket pitch and the King George pub just across the narrow road. With pints of beer and glasses of wine, they sit on benches, deck chairs, and white plastic seats, clapping and cheering their teams. Then, as the warm afternoon progresses, and the beer takes its effect, some begin to doze off, hats covering eyes against the brilliant sun, and mouths drooping to release the occasional slumbered snort. A little way outside the village, along Drover's Lane, is a large red brick house. Everyone in the village calls it the Doctor's House, because ever since anyone could remember, that is where they always went for coughs and sneezes, or when any other thing went wrong with them. Indeed, there had been doctors there for at least 100 years. Every time a doctor got too old and wanted to stop working, he would give the house to one of his children, who was also a doctor, and so the tradition had carried on. Today it was Dr. Philip Jones who was in charge. He was only 34 years old, and everyone thought he was a very good doctor because he was up to date with all the new things you could do in medicine. He was also very thorough, always making sure he knew exactly what was wrong with you and what the best thing was for making you better again. Mostly, people came to the small building next to his house called the surgery. But if people were very ill or just too old, he would go to their own houses. Sometimes this was miles away, because Dr. Jones not only looked after the people in Rushideen, but also those in most of the surrounding villages. He was a very busy man, but he did have some very useful help. When he was in a big hospital training to become a doctor, he had met a very pretty nurse called Ruth. She was not only lovely to look at, but she was also very good at her job. All the patients commented on how well she did everything and how confident she was, but above all, how very kindly she treated everyone. Dr. Jones spent a lot of money buying chocolates, flowers, and taking Nurse Ruth to the cinema and restaurants before he finally had the courage to ask, "Please, will you marry me?" Nurse Ruth thought about it for a few seconds, smiled, and replied, "Yes, that would be a very good idea." Ruth was now the nurse who made appointments for people to come and see her doctor husband. She also gave advice to ladies and especially to pregnant women and young mothers. She patched up cuts and grazes, took blood samples, gave injections, and did lots of other jobs that kept her busy for most of the day. Now, this created a bit of a problem, because Philip and Ruth Jones now had 2 young children who needed looking after. The younger child was Freddie. He was 2.5 years old and very, very active, because ever since he could walk, he wanted to find out about everything. He wanted to touch and pull things that were forbidden, like electric plugs, flowers, the television controller, sharp objects, and any mobile phone that was left lying around. Freddie was not a naughty boy. He was just very interested to see how things felt, how they worked, how they smelt, and even what they tasted like. Many a time he had to be stopped from picking things up in the garden and putting them in his mouth. He had tried to eat mud, a pebble, and even a small slug when nobody was watching, but on the whole he preferred biscuits. Even better, he would have been quite content with his dummy, but he was only allowed to have that when he went to bed or when he had fallen over and was crying. Freddie's brother was Jimmy. Jimmy was 6 years old and always bubbling with ideas, plans and projects. He had a plastic microscope and told everyone he was a world-famous scientist. He had a special toy laser gun and a black cloak when he imagined himself saving the planet from alien invaders. At bath time, he sometimes insisted putting his flippers and goggles on and carrying a grey plastic sword to fight man-eating sharks. Best of all, when his father was using the hose to clean his car, Jimmy would put Freddie in the garden shed and shout, "The shed is burning! Help! 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 I am Fireman Jimmy. I have come to rescue you." Then he would grab the hose and shower the shed with water before rushing into it and grabbing his confused and struggling brother, yanking him to safety. Dr. Jones always hoped that when he was very old, either Jimmy or Freddie would continue the work he was doing. He had already asked Jimmy, "Do you want to be a doctor like me one day?" Seeing people all day long, especially old people, and then giving them medicine didn't seem much fun to Jimmy. No, he certainly didn't want to be a doctor. There were lots of other things he wanted to be. He liked being a fireman, and when once he went on a train to visit Auntie Margot in Scotland, he thought it would be really fantastic to be an engine driver. But topping his list was his favourite thought. He wanted to be an astronaut. The idea of zooming up into space with a huge rocket under him was unimaginably thrilling. What would it be like to stand on the moon, where there was little gravity, and he could take immense leaps and jump higher than a house with little effort? He would be famous, and people would think he was very brave. But these were far-off dreams, because Jimmy and his brother were still very young, and that meant they still needed a lot of looking after. When Freddie was just 1 and Jimmy was 5, Ruth had to get extra help in the house because Philip needed her in the surgery. The solution was to invite an au pair to stay with them. Now, an au pair is usually a teenager or young woman who comes to this country to live with a family, look after its children, and help with housework. She does this so she can learn our language and earn a bit of money. Therese was the au pair that came to stay with the Jones family. She was 18 years old, lots of fun, and very patient with Freddie and Jimmy. At first she could not speak very much English, because she was French and was always looking up English words in a dictionary to see what they meant. She was an extremely good cook and spent a lot of time in the kitchen making very tasty meals. Philip thought this was marvellous, because Ruth had always been too busy to spend any time near the oven. Jimmy sometimes got in the way when Therese was cooking. He would pull at her apron and ask, "Can I lick the bowl now?" Or, "Can I have one of those little cakes?" Or, "Can I put my finger in that chocolate mixture?" Therese always said yes, and then gave him a little kiss, saying, "Ah, tu es mignon, mon petit," which means, "You are so cute, my little one." After a year, the family had to say goodbye to Therese. She had been very happy in the Jones family, but now she wanted to go home because she had learnt how to speak English, and, moreover, she wanted to be with her French boyfriend. Sometimes he had come to England to see her, but now they wanted to be together all the time. The children were very sad when Therese finally said goodbye and got into the car for their father to take her to the airport. She had promised to come back and visit, but that didn't stop the doctor's house suddenly feeling rather lonely. Poor little Freddie was especially confused. At just 2 years of age, he couldn't understand why Therese was no longer there. Ruth and Jimmy tried to explain, but Freddie continued to clamber up the stairs to Therese's old room to see if he could find her. Freddie was still too small to be left on his own, so on weekdays when Ruth went next door to work in the surgery, she took him with her. The surgery had a spare room where Freddie could play. He had lots of his toys there, and also his cot for his afternoon sleep. If he was not at school, and especially at weekends, Jimmy also spent time in the surgery's playroom, but under strict instruction not to make a noise in case it upset the patients in the waiting room. Sometimes he was tempted to go and play with some of the children who came to the surgery, but Ruth told him not to in case they had something horrible like a cough, influenza, or even a really serious illness like meningitis. She didn't want Jimmy or Freddie to be ill as well. Jimmy often wished Therese was still with them, not only because he missed her, but also because she took care of Freddie. Now that she was no longer there, it sometimes meant Jimmy had to look after his brother. During her free time, when she didn't work in the surgery, Ruth would sometimes say to Jimmy, "I've just got to pop out for a few minutes. I'd like you to keep an eye on Freddie. See that he doesn't get up to any mischief, please." Jimmy would often protest, "Mum, I want to go and play with Roger. Can't you take Freddie with you?" It was no use. Ruth was not going to go to the trouble of putting Freddie's Wellingtons on, or his hat and coat, or of getting out the pram just when she was most likely to be back in 5 minutes. The trouble was that 5 minutes often became 30 minutes or more. Everyone knew Ruth, the doctor's wife, and they would stop her in the street to chat about local news, ask after the children, or even request an appointment with Dr. Jones. Meanwhile, Jimmy would grumble to himself, "Where's Mum? She said she'd be back in 5 minutes." Then he would go to the front door to look down the lane and see where she was. Sometimes he was tempted to get on his bike and search for her, but he couldn't do that because that would mean leaving Freddie alone. Now, if Freddie had been about the same age as Jimmy, it wouldn't have mattered, because they could have played the same games. He would even have swapped Freddie for a sister so long as he didn't have to look after her. It seemed to Jimmy that life could be very complicated. Sometimes Jimmy's problem was solved when, instead of going to his friend Roger's house, Roger came to Jimmy's house. Roger was 7 years old and in the class above Jimmy at school. He liked to play at Jimmy's house because the garden was large with a long stretch of grass where they could play football. It was all right so long as little Freddie didn't get in the way, trying to take the ball away when others wanted to kick it. Roger liked the garden because it was rather wild. Dr. Jones never had much time to keep it tidy, so, in places, the grass was as tall as a young boy's legs. Best of all, there were lots of trees. Some of them had quite low branches, which, if you placed a chair or small ladder next to them, you could grab them and begin to climb. Roger called the garden Jimmy's jungle, and imagined it filled with lions, tigers, and even fierce dinosaurs. This was not good news for a long-haired and friendly cat called Monty. Monty had been a stray cat, but was now adopted and part of the Jones family. He spent most of his time outside the house, but early in the morning he was let in to have his fish breakfast. After that he would lick his lips and make his way up the stairs. He was a big cat and went thump, thump, thump as he leapt from step to step on his way to Jimmy's room. Finally, in Jimmy's room, he would stop in front of Jimmy's bed to calculate the height from floor to duvet before making a giant leap. Then, purposefully, he would walk slowly across the bed towards the head hiding under the pillow. Jimmy would suddenly appear, his nose poking above the duvet just in time to make contact with Monty's nose. The cat would give a big vibrating purr and put its furry paws either side of Jimmy's neck. Then Monty would open his mouth very wide to give a big stinky yawn. "Yuck, go away," Jimmy would say as the air filled with fishy smells. Monty simply ignored Jimmy, settling down into the nice warm duvet for a luxurious sleep. Whenever Monty came into the garden to find Jimmy and Roger, he knew very well he would attract their attention. The boys liked to pretend he was a fierce creature that had to be captured. Jimmy would go and get some netting from the garden shed. Then, quietly, slowly, and leaning forward to make themselves look as small as possible, both boys would start to creep up on the cat. Jimmy would hold one end of the net, and Roger would hold the other. Monty always knew what was coming, and as soon as the boys got close and were ready to pounce, he suddenly bolted forward just far enough to be out of reach. Even when they threw the net, Monty was always clever enough to wriggle out of it. When he had had enough of these games, Monty would retreat, either to climb a fence or a tree, far out of reach from any further attack. There he would sit staring at the boys, satisfied and teasing. Jimmy and Roger were sure that behind those big yellow eyes, Monty was laughing at them. Now, if I had a cat like Monty, I wouldn't want to chase him. I would want to stroke him. I wonder what you would like to do. I bet you would like to stroke him too.